Wei Jing's cold and dark pupils swept over the young man's whole body one by one. His inscrutable gaze lingered on his face for a moment. When he clearly saw the rare impatience showing on the young man's brow, the interest in his eyes grew deeper.
Play chess with me.
Sheng Jiaoyue didn't feel very secure at the moment. She sat opposite him, restless, with her delicate brows furrowed. Taking a deep breath, she said slowly,
Your Highness, I'm not very good at chess. It would be better to ask the Crown Prince's son to play with you for a match.
Wei Jing raised his eyes and stared at him for a couple of seconds. He was sparing with his words.
It doesn't matter.
Sheng Jiaoyue was in no mood to play chess. She managed to calm herself down and took the chess pieces handed over by the Crown Prince. The young man's thumb was slender and snow-white, with a thin blush on the fingertip. Her fair hands held the white jade chess pieces as she played against the man on the chessboard absent-mindedly. Sheng Jiaoyue knew the Crown Prince's habits when playing chess. He liked to torture his opponents, slowly setting traps. When you fell into the net, he would watch you struggle desperately. Only when you were on your last breath would he slowly draw in the net and force you into a dead end. She was indeed no match for him in chess. The man was meticulous and extremely patient. Even though she knew she would lose, Sheng Jiaoyue didn't give up perfunctorily. She played a game of chess with him seriously. She vaguely saw the hope of winning, but in the end, she still lost the whole game. Sheng Jiaoyue didn't care about winning or losing on the chessboard. She just wanted to go back to her room quickly. The empty lapels made her feel uneasy. When she was nervous, she liked to rub her fingers. Her slender hands tightly grasped the sleeves. Seeing her restlessness, Wei Jing couldn't help but look at her a few more times. The young man with a cold outline and fair complexion had his brows tightly furrowed, his mouth pressed into a straight line. The way he frowned and looked anxious seemed as if he had encountered an extremely difficult problem. Wei Jing rarely saw him so restless. He had thought that he could remain calm no matter what happened. The man became interested and asked the servants to bring hot tea. Then he said slowly,
Let's play another game.
Sheng Jiaoyue really couldn't sit still any longer. Delicate and translucent beads of sweat were forming on her snow-white forehead. She felt so uncomfortable and ill at ease. She pursed her red lips and said,
Your Highness, I suddenly don't feel well. I'd like to go back and rest first.
After saying this, she lowered her head and eyes, not looking at the Crown Prince's expression. Even with her eyes closed, she could sense the sharp and searing gaze falling on her from above.
For a long while. His beautiful phoenix eyes stared at him quietly, the gaze almost piercing a hole through his body. He let out a light chuckle and said,
Where don't you feel well? Explain it carefully.
Sheng Jiaoyue was stunned for a moment. She didn't expect the Crown Prince to question her in such detail. Before she could say anything, she heard the man say coldly again,
If you can't give a proper explanation, just wait and see how I'll punish you.
Sheng Jiaoyue pressed her lips into a straight line and remained silent, not knowing how to answer. She hadn't expected the Crown Prince to flare up so suddenly. The faint moonlight cast a cold glow, falling calmly on the young man's side face, reflecting his snow-white and porcelain-like skin. Wei Jing lowered his eyes to observe his expression. His tightly pursed lips were a straight line, and his look showed restlessness. Wei Jing asked coldly,
Are you deaf or dumb?
Sheng Jiaoyue lifted her eyelids. Her gaze met the Crown Prince's cold stare. His gloomy and indifferent eyes showed a somewhat intimidating pressure. She could only suppress the urge to leave the table and reluctantly continued to play chess with the Crown Prince. The day had ended and the night was pitch black. In the second game of chess, Sheng Jiaoyue still lost to the Crown Prince. Since the Crown Prince didn't let her go, it means he wants to continue. When they were putting the chess pieces away, the Crown Prince suddenly asked,
Why have you been hunched over all the time?
Such a slouching posture, looking so timid, what kind of appearance is that? Sheng Jiaoyue clenched the chess pieces in her hand. Her delicate and fair fingers trembled slightly. Her heart was in her throat. She tried her best to stay calm, to avoid being noticed by the Crown Prince. She took a deep breath. When her breathing was steady, she found an excuse to fend off the question.
The night is so dark that I can't see the chessboard clearly.
Wei Jing's inscrutable gaze had never left her. He let out a meaningful "oh" and clapped his hands twice. Soon, 2 new candle lamps were brought by the attendants. The bright firelight illuminated the two of them more clearly. Sheng Jiaoyue felt a tingling on her scalp under the Crown Prince's gaze. She regretted that she had shot herself in the foot. The bright and flickering candlelight shone on her body. With just a little cover-up, her secret would be revealed. She was really annoyed. Habitually, she bit her lip with her teeth. The pale corners of her lips were rubbed to show a slight tinge of blood. Fine cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Wei Jing stared at her eyes that she were trying hard to lower. He asked,
Can you see clearly now?
Sheng Jiaoyue said in a low voice.
Enough.
In the twinkling of an eye, several sticks of incense had burned out, indicating the passing of time. The Crown Prince finally seemed to be getting tired. He ordered his servants to put away the chessboard. Seeing this, Sheng Jiaoyue let out a sigh of relief. She was just about to take her leave when the Crown Prince called her over again. The man was strong and had long limbs. Standing in front of her, his tall figure blocked all the light in front of her. The faint yet familiar smell of ambergris wafted around her nose. This faint and familiar smell of ambergris reminded Sheng Jiaoyue of some unpleasant memories. The Crown Prince had a domineering temperament. After ascending the throne and becoming the new emperor, his domineering nature only grew stronger. It was bad enough that he locked her in the harem and wouldn't let her go out. He had to meddle in everything, from what clothes she wore every day to what kind of incense she used. He had to interfere in every little detail. The new emperor bestowed upon her the title of concubine to humiliate her and take revenge for her betrayal. Only ambergris was allowed to be burned in the palace, and she was not allowed to use her former sachets anymore. Sheng Jiaoyue didn't even know what was wrong with her being used to the light fragrance of pearwood. One night, the new emperor pinched her waist and left teeth marks on her shoulder, biting so hard that the skin broke and bled.
You are not allowed to have the smell of anyone else on you. Don't think that I don't know who gave you that pearwood sandalwood. Since you are mine, every inch of you, inside and out, belongs to me.
Sheng Jiaoyue was so exhausted from being tormented at that time that she had fallen into a deep sleep and didn't hear clearly what the man had said. Sheng Jiaoyue came back to her senses and bowed her head.
Does your Highness have any other instructions?
Wei Jing raised his arms.
Help me change my clothes.
This kind of thing shouldn't have been done by her. Sheng Jiaoyue was just about to speak when the Crown Prince interrupted her expressionlessly.
I didn't bring my personal attendants this time. And it's not like you can't do it.
Swallowing her anger, she stepped forward, held her breath, lowered her eyes, and only mustered up the courage to start. However, Sheng Jiaoyue was used to being served at home and was really not good at things like dressing and undressing. Her hands struggled with the buttons on the Crown Prince's waist for a long time. It took her a great deal of effort to untie the man's belt. Then she frowned as she stared at his clothes, looking worried, as if she was thinking about where to start next. Wei Jing looked down at her clumsy way of undressing him and was actually amused by this pampered young master. It seemed that he never did any manual work in the Sheng family. Wei Jing was gradually losing his patience. Frowning, he said coldly,
Enough.
Sheng Jiaoyue stopped immediately at his words. Wei Jing easily untied his wrist guards by himself and tossed them aside casually. Suddenly, his eyes narrowed as he stared intently at the young man's slender figure. His cold gaze swept over the young man's whole body without any emotion. Staring at his chest, he suddenly asked,
Is this garment of yours too big?
During the time when she was being closely watched by the Crown Prince just now, Sheng Jiaoyue felt almost choked up. Her heart in her throat was pounding so hard that it seemed about to jump out. Suppressing the uneasiness in her heart, she said,
Yes, it doesn't fit very well.
Wei Jing walked slowly towards him, closing in on his body. Sheng Jiaoyue had to pinch her palm hard to force herself not to turn around and run. Her feet seemed rooted to the spot. The man's finger gently lifted the collar of her garment. But in an instant, he withdrew his hand. He said,
Could it be that you rushed over here without even dressing properly?
Sheng Jiaoyue thought to herself that she was forcibly brought here by Xing Kuan. She said,
I was in a hurry to go out, so it was indeed a bit hasty.
Wei Jing had no idea what Xing Kuan had done. Naturally, he misinterpreted it as her being as eager as before to flatter and please him. The little bit of favorable impression he had just developed vanished immediately, and disgust grew in his heart, though his face remained expressionless. He just waved his hand at her and said faintly,
"You may go back."
Sheng Jiaoyue felt as if she had been granted a great pardon and hurriedly left the room. The guard on night duty outside was Sheng Kuan. When he saw Sheng Jiaoyue, he seemed to curl his lips into a light chuckle. The unfriendly smile looked more like a sneer. What a weak little chick. If he showed any ill intentions, Sheng Kuan would make sure he died right there. Sheng Jiaoyue returned to the room where she was staying. Only then did her tense body get a chance to relax. She locked the door bolt, sat on the chair and drank 2 cups of tea in succession, barely suppressing the fright she had just experienced. Outside, the wind and snow were raging. The doors and windows were being beaten by the wind and snow, making a whistling sound. The cold wind seeped into the simple side chamber, through the cracks. Even with the stove burning, it couldn't withstand the wind and snow in the middle of winter. Sheng Jiaoyue only had one quilt. After getting into bed, she wrapped herself up in the quilt and huddled up. She didn't sleep well that night. Fragmented dreams from her past life kept disturbing her. Her limbs were getting colder and colder, while the temperature on her face was rising continuously. The next day was still a heavy snow day, and no one knew when the blizzard would stop. When having breakfast, someone noticed that the young master of the Sheng family didn't show up. In the temple, in the morning, one not only had to eat vegetarian meals, but also listen to the monks chanting scriptures. Gu Qinglin wore a dark blue long gown this morning. His eyes were slightly curved, and a faint, harmless smile still hung on his lips. He said casually,
"At the 5th watch of the night, young Master Sheng probably couldn't get up."
Wei Jing had of course heard that Sheng Jiaoyue was a bit pampered outside. He didn't like such a style, so he put on a cold face and asked Sheng Kuan to go and call him. Sheng Kuan soon returned.
Your Highness, it seems that young Master Sheng is ill.
Sheng Jiaoyue had a high fever that night. The weather was bitterly cold, and she was weak. After suffering a fright and having nightmares, she only had one quilt to sleep with at night, and thus caught a cold and fell ill. The Crown Prince didn't bring the imperial physician when he went up the mountain to the temple this time. However, there was a doctor among the attendants serving Gu Qinglin. After briefly examining the complexion and tongue coating, the doctor said,
Young Master Sheng is not seriously ill. It's just that the cold wind has entered his body, and his previous waist injury hasn't fully healed, so the illness came on suddenly.
Wei Jing waved his hand to let the attendant go and prepare the medicine. He himself condescended to step into Sheng Jiaoyue's room. There were stoves burning in all 4 corners of the room, making it warm and pleasant. Only the person on the bed was tightly wrapped in the quilt. A faint flush appeared on his snow-white face, his lips were slightly parted, and a faint snore could be heard when one got closer. Wei Jing was holding the medicine for treating injuries. He slowly sat down on the bedside. The young man with a sickly, thin red complexion on his face happened to wake up slowly at this moment. He blinked his still somewhat hazy eyes and stared at him for quite a while before recognizing him.
Your Highness.
Wei Jing moved his eyes away from this face that was even more beautiful than a woman's, and simply replied with Then he lifted his quilt and asked him to turn his back to him and lie on his stomach. Sheng Jiaoyue was a bit puzzled.
What's going on?
It was because of him that she got the injury on her waist. Wei Jing rarely felt a bit of apology. He pursed his lips and said,
The doctor said your waist injury hasn't healed yet.
The man had already frowned impatiently after saying that. He reached out to help her take off her clothes.
I'll apply the medicine for you myself.
Sheng Jiaoyue almost fainted. She thought she was still in the nightmare and hadn't woken up. She was so frightened that her face turned pale, and her trembling body couldn't help shrinking back.
No, don't bother your Highness. I'll do it myself.
Wei Jing sneered coldly.
Can you see it yourself? Can you through with your hands?
They were both men. Was it really that bad to look at his delicate skin and tender flesh? So pretentious.